Good morning. This is Karen from the Meaning Code. Um, you all may remember Glen, who has been my guest for 6 episodes on the Meaning Code. And we were talking about the nature of life. And the other day I saw this video that really struck me that it would be interesting to Glen. So I sent it to him and he said, let's have a talk about it. So we got together and talked, but because we were taping it for ourselves and not for public consumption, I didn't do an intro at the beginning of the video, but we both decided it was such a great conversation. We wanted to share it with you. So I'm going to play for you the little video that caught our interest, and then it'll hook up to our conversation. So I hope that makes sense. Right now, I'm going to share screen and show you this video. It's a researcher. It's a researcher by the name of Michael Levin, and he's talking about his findings regarding how cells communicate with one another.
Communicate biochemically and via physical forces, but there's something else that's going on that's extremely interesting, and that is that it's basically called bioelectricity, non-neural bioelectricity. So it turns out that all cells, not just nerves, but all cells in your body communicate with each other using electrical signals. And what you're seeing here is a time-lapse video. For the first time, we are now able to eavesdrop on all of the electrical conversations that the cells are having with each other. So think about this. We're now watching. This is an early frog embryo. This is about 8 hours to 10 hours of development. And the colors are showing you actual electrical states that allows you to see all of the electrical software that's running on the genome-defined cellular hardware. And so these cells are basically communicating with each other who's going to be head, who's going to be tail, who's going to be left and right, and make eyes and brain and so on. And so it is this software that allows these living systems to achieve specific goals such as building an embryo or regenerating a limb for animals that do this. And the ability to see these electrical conversations gives us some really remarkable opportunities to target or to rewrite the goals towards which these living systems are operating.
Okay, so this is pretty radical. Let me see if I understand this. What you're saying is that when an organism starts to develop, as soon as the cell divides, electrical signals are shared between them. But as you get to, what, a few hundred cells, that somehow these signals end up forming a kind of, essentially like a computer program, a program that somehow includes all the information needed to tell that organism what its destiny is. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes, quite. Basically, what happens is that these cells, by forming electrical networks, much like networks in the brain, they form electrical networks, and these networks process information, including pattern memories. They include representation of large-scale anatomical structures where various organs will go, what the different axes of the animal, front and back, head and tail, are going to be. And these are literally held in the electrical circuits across large tissues, in the same way that that brains hold other kinds of memories and learning.
So is this the right way to think about it? Because this seems to me such a big shift. I mean, when I first got a computer, I was in awe of the people who could kind of do so-called machine code, like the direct programming of individual bits in the computer. That was impossible for most mortals. To have a chance of controlling that computer, you'd have to program in a language, which was just a vastly simpler way of making big picture things happen. And if I understand you right, what you're saying is that most of biology today has sort of taken place trying to do the equivalent of machine code programming, of like understanding the biochemical signals between individual cells, when, wait a sec, holy crap, there's this language going on, this electrical language, which if you could understand that would give us a completely different set of insights into how organisms are development. Is that metaphor basically right?
Yeah, this is exactly right. So if you think about the way programming was done in the 40s, in order to get your computer to do something different, you would physically have to shift the wires around. So you would have to go in there and rewire the hardware. You would have to interact with the hardware directly, and all of your strategies for manipulating that machine would be at the level of the hardware. And the reason we have this now amazing technology revolution, information sciences and so on, is because computer science moved from a focus on the hardware onto understanding that if your hardware is good enough, and I'm going to tell you that biological hardware is absolutely good enough, then you can interact with your system not by tweaking or rewiring the hardware, but actually you can take a step back and give it stimuli or inputs the way that you would give to a reprogrammable computer, and cause the cellular network to do something completely different than it would otherwise have done. So
I'm going to stop it there, although I will put a link in the video. That is a discussion between Glen and myself, so that you can watch the rest of it, because it's definitely worth watching. So our conversation is going to begin now, but I won't publish it.
Okay, well, if it works and it looks like it's going to go someplace, we can always come back and then do it more formally.
Yeah, and would you be interested in talking to him if I can get him to come on this channel?
Well, I feel like I'm out of my league. I've watched him, and he seems like a very intelligent, insightful man. I'm not sure I'm in his category.
You guys bring two different perspectives.
Yeah, the whole biology side is completely outside my realm of expertise background.
Well, probably when he started on this, the whole computer science thing was outside of his league, but now he's got to take a look at it, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah. What do you make of that?
I'm curious. What I saw discussed, he was introducing the notion of computation, the moderator. Mm-hmm. And I thought, yes, that's exactly what you're seeing is a state machine. But instead of, electronics or relays, in this case, the states are chemical or electrical. I'm not sure people actually can see that, but I see it.
So I want you to help me see it. Okay, so when you talked about finite state machines before, one of the examples that you used, I think, I haven't reviewed my homework, so we're doing a kitchen remodel, and I've been spending night and day trying to get everything put together for that, so I'm out of the loop. But I recall you saying something about like the old coin meters. That's a kind of a state machine.
Right.
You drop the coin in, and it judges the shape and the weight, and it determines if that's going to open the meter or not.
Yeah, counts up, and then when it gets the right number of coins, it hits they call it the stopping state or the final state, at which point whatever latch mechanism relay gets tripped, and you get a little printed out card in that example.
Okay, so in his video, he talked about very early in the development of the tadpole, these cells are talking to each other, and once they get up to like 100 cells or so, they actually form a little computer program, and they start telling each other where to go and what part to be. Now, the reason that caught my attention is that I've listened to a lot of Rupert Sheldrake in the past. And the way he has always explained DNA, and I'm assuming he's telling the truth, he says DNA only tells the organism what to build, not where to put it. That the blueprints are not in the DNA. The DNA only tells what proteins to make, and then those proteins make certain parts, but not where to put those parts. So like a DNA wouldn't tell an arm where to be.
Right.
And that's why he came up with this idea of morphic resonance as a memory that's out there in the universe about how things should go together. But what this guy said made a lot more sense to me, that it's not a memory out there in the universe telling these things how to go together, but there is a machine code, for lack of a better word, that's where they're working together and
Mhm.
organizing in a way like ants would organize or like bees would organize, right?
Exactly. Mhm.
So how is that like a state machine?
Uh, if I'm watching the electrical signals, you know, and that then you can see the different activity areas.
Mhm.
And I'm guessing whatever that activity is going on at the cell boundaries that you're visualizing in that little sequence, that is somehow telling the cells what to start doing internally, how to start specializing. So there's a pattern which is trying to emerge in the embryo. And that pattern then downward causality, something you might want to call it, then tells the individual cells what to keep doing from there. So there's like this overriding. I keep coming back to the notion of strong emergence, which there's a downward causality.
Mhm.
And what I'm sensing, you know, this is just me, is that what you're seeing happen is some kind of downward causality telling the cells how to go, which is not starts to sound like Rupert Sheldrake, but that computational process, which is the strong emergent layer up there, is telling the individual layers how to go, but that's a program. It's developing, I'm watching like a state machine, a program develop. And that's one of the fascinating things I think about is if you have a computer system, and I mentioned that in the email, that is capable of self-assembly. And this is a real research area. So the computer is running, it's assembling itself, it's controlling its own self-assembly. How would the computer program know what to do next? That's kind of an open question, but it's a very real question in computer, you know, world of computers. And I sense that what he was seeing with the embryo was exactly the same problem. So if I'm approaching this in hardware design, then I'm looking at this asynchronous array processor, which I've kind of alluded to in my emails, is building itself, but somehow it has to know what it wants to do next, which implies that there's some other program there which is not embedded in the hardware or the coding at each cell, which is telling it what to do. And I find that fascinating because it kind of takes Rupert Sheldrake's ideas, but it gives them a nice concrete form. And it says, well, it's not woo-woo. I have a piece of hardware in front of me that's trying to do it. So what's my hardware trying to do?
Well, okay, so let's back up a minute. If it is similar to the way that bees or ants organize,
Mhm.
okay, what tells them how to organize?
Good question. What is it in, you know, the individual ants have their own little programming. Some are soldiers, some are workers. Somehow, and they only act locally. They only know what's going on around them and what signals they've picked up from other ants that they meet going back and forth. But somehow, in all of that, this group intelligence forms up, which is, for all practical purposes, a single entity in its own right. And it starts making decisions, you know, hunting, foraging, building nests, acting out in ways that we call it, you know, ant colony. But that ant colony behavior is not anywhere in the ants, nowhere. But yet, how did it come from? And
Well, let's take it down a step because, yeah, I see where you're going with, I think I see where you're going with this, but if you take it down a step and just look at an individual ant or an individual spider,
Mhm.
some of them have very sophisticated jobs. There's a
Yeah.
particular kind of an ant that farms aphids.
Mhm.
gathers aphids off of the rose bushes or wherever it gets them. It builds a little barn for them using some kind of thread that it can spin over
Yeah.
leaves
Mhm.
to protect the aphids, to keep them all in a place. And then it milks the aphids by stroking the aphid so that the milk comes out, and that's its food source. That's an individual ant. That's not a whole conglomeration of ants coming up with some kind of intelligence. That's a little individual ant that has a very sophisticated job.
Right. But he still couldn't do that job if it wasn't for the whole rest of the colony being there too, and other ants doing the same thing. So that's one of the things I always try and do, is I step back and say, well, is this an individual action, or does this individual need the colony in order to do what it's doing?
Well, how about spiders building webs?
Uh,
Do they need a colony of spiders in order to build webs?
no, it seems to be programmed into them.
And that's a very sophisticated, sophisticated architectural feat that requires very sophisticated movements and balance and strength and spinning the little web.
Yeah.
I mean, really,
Mhm.
So, and of course, you know me, I mean, I'm coming at this strictly from my sense of woo is not Rupert Sheldrake's sense of woo, but my sense of woo is in him all things hold together. He is the architect of the universe. He is the author and perfecter of our souls. He is the pattern maker. So if there's some kind of a pattern there, I think he's the one who makes the pattern.
Yep.
And there's some way in which his world and our world are interpenetrating each other. So it's opaque to us. We can't see it. Scientists can't find it because it's in another, I don't want to use the word dimension, but it's in another dimension. And it's interpenetrating with us so that somehow, unless you buy the idea that we are a simulation and all this stuff is computer programmed, otherwise, how do you get down to, well, first of all, how did we come up with the idea of writing computer programs? Right? Is it just because we rose up far enough on the food chain that this capacity to write computer programs emerged and is now having this downward causality on us?
Okay, well, we've just fallen into another discussion on natural language versus formal language.
Okay.
How did natural language evolve in the first place? If you look at,
Now, remind me again, you have to give me more background on natural language so that I really understand what you mean when you say that.
well, I use it in the term, or in the sense that anytime you have a social group, it could be ants, it could be termites, it could be a wolf pack. In order for the social group to come together and function, there has to be some kind of communication going on between all of the individual elements that form that group.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would call it a language, in a very abstract sense. Some kind of language has to arise that allows a communication between the individuals. And that language can't be dependent on, it has to be something that's shareable. So it has to be based on a common experience between the individuals. So if you look at the more primitive languages in animals, the kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
they are mostly emotional. I'm hungry, I'm fearful. Go on, but
So
something.
that would be Mark Solmes's brainstem with the
It's Jordan Peterson.
And hungry and
Jordan Peterson's lobster analogy with the dominance hierarchy starts up. If there's a dominance hierarchy, then there's got to be some way to decide that, which means little ritual fighting between the males and shows of strength, or I think in some birds it might be colorful feathers, colorful mating dances, deer's horns. Something happens that allows a dominance hierarchy, a layering of tasks within the colony or the swarm, something happened along the way that our language stopped being simply emotional. You know, I'm stronger than you, or if you're like a wolf pack, I go out front, you go to the side, we attack. We start developing words or vocalizations for objects. So this is my theory. This is just the thing that makes sense to me when I try and do formal language analogies. Excuse me. So instead of saying run, danger, you can say run, a lion, danger. Now all of a sudden we start having a brain and a language that encapsulates objects and relationships between objects. And I think as that kind of language evolved, it evolved in concert with the world we observe. As we communicated with each other, we would notice that rocks fall and things fly, and we incorporated into our natural language logic. You know, we would see causality in the world around us, so of course it would be incorporated into our language as it evolved, as we creatures evolved over the millennia. And so here we go, we fast forward to modern days, and our language is rich in descriptive elements, as well as still having that core of emotive elements. And the reason I got onto this track was I was looking at the work of Gottlob Frege. He was one of the pioneers in math logic. He wrote back in the mid 1800s. And essentially what he, what he was trying to do was look at language and try and figure out how you could do a word problem. And that's the fascinating thing, is that we can actually create a word problem in our language. And how do you pull that word problem out of the natural language and turn it into something formal like mathematics or logic or physics statements that then you can manipulate?
You mean, does that include even a simple word problem like Johnny has 4 apples and he gives 1 to Mary. How many apples does Johnny have left?
Exactly.
Okay.
So so he started looking at sentence structure, and some of his early notation looks an awful lot like the sentence diagramming stuff we had to do. I don't know if you had to when you were in grade. I don't know if the kids do it anymore. So he started noticing the formal structure that would be embedded in a natural language statement. And so he pulled that out, and so then you started to see the beginnings of what we would call math logic. It evolved to what it is today. But that's
So
where
is that language specific, or is it irrespective of what language it is? You know, because every language has a different grammar. So you said he started noticing the structure.
So it's probably German.
Grammar or something one level above grammar?
You know, you've got me on that one.
Because you know, like in Japanese, the grammar structure is almost entirely backwards from English. Or I mean, you could say English is backwards from Japanese, depending on your perspective. You know, I ate breakfast today. In Japanese, you'd say something like, breakfast today ate I, or you know, something like that. It's all mixed up. But you know, for them it totally makes sense because that's their grammar. You know, so every language has a different grammatical structure. And Frege was obviously working in English, German.
I assume German with a last name like Frege.
Yeah, German is fairly similar to English in terms of language structure.
One thing I always like to say is German is compiled and Spanish is interpreted. as languages go, which is why
they have a word for everything in German.
Well, in German, you have to wait till the end of the sentence to find out what the verbs were, you know, so Spanish is more flowing. A German sentence could be a paragraph long, and you know, you've got to wait till the end to know what people were saying.
That's kind of the way Japanese is too. Yeah, you have to wait until the end.
Well, my son's taking Japanese this term, so he seems to be doing okay. I don't know what's up, but
Mhm. The funniest thing about Japanese is because of their humility, I guess, they never use the personal pronoun. Like they wouldn't say, I went to the store. They'd just say, went to the store.
mhm,
Then if they're talking to each other about somebody else, they'll say, went to the store. And you have to guess, did they mean he went to the store or she went to the store?
mhm,
Was it Mary? Was it John? You have no idea. You have to
mhm.
listen to the whole conversation to get the context of who the pronoun was, because they don't mess with that.
Mhm.
I mean,
But
when they teach Americans where to put the subject in the sentence. So Americans always sound foreign because they're saying, I did this or he did that, but a Japanese would never do that. They would never have the subject in the sentence.
mhm. So you spoke Japanese?
Oh, I was fluent. Yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
I lived there for 3 years and I went to language school the first 2 years, and I could have conversations with people about farming and business and stuff like that. I mean, I learned at a pretty deep level, and I learned to write 800 Chinese characters, but most of that is gone. I mean, I learned to write and read 800 Chinese characters, but I can't read it anymore. Yeah,
Mhm.
well, the Chinese characters are used in Japanese, but my knowledge of Japanese is down to 2 or 3 sentences that I can say with some fluency, and that's
Mhm.
it, because I haven't spoken it for 40 years now.
Okay, well, I guess the punchline I'm trying to get to is a lot of the logic, the ordering principles we call math and stuff came to us through language as it developed naturally as we interacted with the universe around us. So that's, I think, I'm going to speculate that that's why when we create a word problem, it somehow makes sense. That's why math, the unreasonable effectiveness of math, why it works is because it evolved evolutionarily with us. Those kind of relationships, we saw it in the world. So the physical world around us got impressed into our language structure. So when we start talking about these things, it naturally mirrors the physical universe correctly. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's I've listened to so many of those closer to truth things where he always asks the question, is math discovered or invented? And everybody has a different answer.
Mhm.
Quite a few people believe it was discovered, that math is just there. I kind of think that Nima Arkani Hamed would think that math was discovered
Yes,
after listening to
definitely.
him, that it's a crystalline structure that's kind of there in the
Mhm.
universe, and you stumble on some part of it, and then you get an aha, and then you have something new,
Mhm.
like the imaginary number. I don't see how that could be invented, because it works so well with everything.
Mhm.
So it seems like it had to be, it's something that nobody would ever really think up, and yet it works, and so it seems to be like that was one that was like discovered. Right? So
Yeah.
I'm on that path, but you're saying, well, maybe what you're saying, let me see if I understand you well, that if language evolved, if we evolved, and if language evolved, that
Mhm.
language evolved um, over time as we interacted with the world, the way that the world was being constructed around us and in front of us, and the relationships that we saw. And so that's why language fits so well with the world the way it is. So that could be one of those things that's like when you words kind of fail, but if mathematics is discovered, when someone makes a discovery in mathematics, it's because the universe or God or whatever you want to call that gave you an insight, and that insight becomes a part of your apparatus,
Mhm.
and maybe language evolved that way. These were insights, because I mean, my feeling, I have a very strong belief that language was totally a gift. and that the first language, that there was just one language in the beginning, and that it was a gift from God, and whether that gift was parsed out over many centuries or millennia, or whether that gift was offered all at once, I don't know. But when you go back and you look at ancient history, the languages are already very robust and very complex and very pragmatic and useful and abstract, and can go as deep as you want to go, deeper than we go now.
Yeah, actually, the classic Greek was a richer language than modern English, which explains a lot of the problems trying to understand the New Testament.
Yeah, and they could think way deeper than we can think. You know, they just so.
Oh, could you give me a break for like a minute, and I'll be right back.
No problem.
Since we're on this direction.
Okay.
Exactly. Well, you be careful. Right? It's only on the X, so you got to be careful. Right. Well, looks like you have your afternoon planned out for you. I have to get going. It's time for me to grab something to eat before my next class. But thank you for reminding me what calculus looks like. It's been a while. Well, I should say 5B looks like. It's been over years. If I don't keep refreshing the stuff this way. I don't know.
I wanted to ask you, you know,
Okay, can you hear me?
yeah, back when you were, when I met you at Paul's, meetup,
Yes.
was Paula with you then?
He was there that day.
No, Paula. Was Paula with you?
No, you've never met Paula.
Okay. Well, there was another guy there who had his wife with him, and they were both very, very interested in Jordan Peterson. And maybe she was a psychologist, but Paula's a teacher, right? Yeah. I was just wondering if that was Paula that I met, but.
No,
Okay.
no. So I don't know if you can see this, but this would be a fun talk sometime, is look at Galileo and Copernicus and all that, because 95% of what people think they know is either wrong or half truth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Can you see that? Is it readable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, this is
All the
Ptolemy's.
texts by Ptolemy, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres by Nicolaus Copernicus, and Epitome of Copernican Astronomy, or
Oh, that's
The
this.
Harmonics of the World by Johannes Kepler.
Yeah, so this is a collection of all three works.
Oh, okay.
But this is one of the reasons Ptolemy's, I'm gonna try and do this. Okay. I'll probably have to do better, but this was why the Earth-centered model of the solar system lasted for so long.
Because of saving the appearances?
Saving the appearances, but this is Ptolemy's work. He wrote this in about 150 AD is when this started. Okay, I'll just flip pages.
What is all that? What are all those? Wow.
Okay, this goes on for like 400 pages of calculations, methods, tables, lookup tables, math. This came out of Greek, 2nd century world. And it just goes on, you know. A first-year student in physics would have a hard time getting through this. This was a level of Greek science, you know, roughly not too long after Jesus walked the face of the earth. And this is why the heliocentric model of the solar system one of the reasons it never caught on, because it never had this level of mathematics to back it up.
Mhm.
So along comes Copernicus, which, you know, he didn't invent it, but what I'm really beginning to think is what he wanted to do was to recreate for the, you know, the sun-centered model of the solar system equivalent mathematical machinery,
Mhm.
which he failed at. And that's probably the reason he didn't publish, wasn't the fear of persecution, but he never finished. It was such a monumental work. And Kepler was the one who actually finished Copernicus's work and nailed it down. But anyway, I think that's
that would be a very interesting conversation sometime.
Mhm.
I could just be your student, and I think my listeners would just really love that. And, you know, we could weave in a little bit of this idea of the saving the appearances. And who was that guy that wrote the book in the last century that you talked
Pierre
about?
Duhem.
Yes.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think that's a critical.
And it would clean up the history for some people, especially the ones that don't understand or that are still carrying around some of the hostility towards the church because of Galileo and all of that stuff.
Mhm. Well, it would be fun, and people would learn things they didn't know.
Mhm.
And it would hopefully be a motivation to dive deeper back into the history.
Mhm.
So anyway, my point is the world that Paul was preaching to, the Greek world, was incredibly sophisticated, even by our standards today.
Mhm.
So anyway, now I forgot where we were at.
Well, we were talking about natural language, and you had gotten to the point where you were saying that the logic and the ordering principles came naturally as we interacted with the universe around us. And then you said the unreasonable effectiveness of math, and that's when I butted in. So you were talking about natural language because you said that you wanted to discuss natural language in the context of the communication that forms in a group. There's some kind of language that allows communication, because we were back talking about these cells that are talking to each other, and how is it that this computer program forms up.
Mhm.
Talked about ant colonies and all that. And then we talked specifically about even when you get down to like a spider, where do they get that information, and where is this information coming from that gives the cells this computer program? That's
Mhm.
the stage that we were at. And then you said this would be a good place to bring in natural language.
Mhm.
So then I said, well, remind me again, what is natural language?
Now I've forgotten why I said that.
Yeah, so natural language is, in other words, natural language is distinct from formal language, in that natural language is just the language that we have developed over
Right,
eons.
but formal language is embedded in natural language.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that's necessarily appreciated by a lot of people. That formal language isn't, math is not something separate from our world. It's distilled out of our language. It's already there. We just have to, that's why we can write a word problem for math or physics.
So you're saying that because of the argument that some people like Luke Thompson would make, that, or like Nate would make, that formal language is not sufficient to talk about these things because it's too, what, abstracted?
I
So
don't
they
know.
would say abstracted and you would say distilled, which is that's a different thing.
But you remarked on the imaginary number. If we just left to common sense and what seemed right, we would never get there. Or something like the Banach-Tarski, paradox.
Mhm.
if we just used reasonable thinking, we would never get there. So my response is formal language and think, lets you go places that you would never ever go otherwise. So I tend to see formal language is much more through the looking glass, Alice in Wonderland world. That's how I experience it. And so I don't understand why people can see it as such a dead end.
Well,
anyway.
it may be because that's the way you experience it.
Mhm.
And that may be why you are uniquely qualified to talk about these things, because you
Yeah.
see into a world that most of us cannot see into.
Well, that's what I would tell people, that physics isn't a subject I study. It's a place I go.
Mhm.
And I travel and have adventures in and explore. And literally, that's how I experience it. So it's much more real to me than I think most people experience, which is why I have a hard time communicating.
That sounds so much like the way Eric Weinstein talks about mathematics.
Mhm.
That's the way he talks about it. That's why he called his show The Portal,
Mhm.
because mathematics for him is window into another world, and he just goes in there and explores. And
Yeah, and then when I do that, sometimes I'm gone, and people, my friends, just go, okay, well, I guess we're not going to hear from Glen for the next 3 or 4 weeks or something, and then he'll show up again. And
that's such a great thing. Okay, so formal language is embedded in and distilled from natural language. That's a very helpful picture, so I can work on that.
right, and that's one of the reasons we can actually communicate, I think, between each other, and language allows for learning, is because we each have a common set of experiences in reality. So when we try and communicate with each other, we have a template already in each of our heads to work with. And as long as we all share the same template, roughly, we can talk to each other. And when you get a group of people that don't share a common template, then that's when communications break down. And I think that happens at all levels, from computers all the way up to people.
So back to these cells in the tadpole, they are utilizing some kind of formal language. Is that your thesis?
Language in the theory of computation sense. And I think when people use when word language, they think of talking or expressing something. But a language
I was thinking of like a computer language, but I mean, I don't want to use the word computer, but language in the theory of computation sense
is a set of sentences. That's all. So in the simplest word, Hamlet could be a language. Whatever's in Hamlet is considered a valid sentence in a language. And so you can, whatever recognizes Hamlet as a language would
so it's like a pattern.
Mm-hmm. So you can have a language which is just a set of sentences, a collection of all valid sentences. Then you have a grammar.
You meant like in the formal word.
Right, in the formal sense, it's just a collection of valid sentences. And a sentence is valid if there's a state machine or some computational device that recognizes it, which will run it. You start with the first letter of the sentence, or the first symbol. It starts at the initial state of your computational system, and you go through the sentence, symbol by symbol, until you get to the end. And if at the end of the sentence you're at the stopping state of the state machine, then it's a valid sentence. That's pretty basic, but it's amazing. From a simple idea like that, you can keep building up more and more complicated things until you get full all on mathematics.
Why is that so hard for me to understand? I mean, what you just said, the words were simple. I'm assuming the idea is a simple idea, but
it's mind-numbingly simple.
Okay, let me take a sentence. Mary had a little lamb. I'm gonna start with the first symbol, which is an M. And how do I make my way to the last symbol? Are you
There's the
looking
lookup
at this as
table.
reading it or a lookup table?
There's some kind of lookup table that says, okay, I'm in state 3 and I just saw the letter M, so I'm going to go to state 4 now. But if I saw the letter A, then I would have gone to state 102. That's how state machines work. You give it an input, and then based on the input, it makes a transition to the next state. Generally, at the grunt level, it's more like A, B, C, D, 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 E, F, A. You know, that would be a sentence of the alphabet of symbols. And then each letter corresponds to a transition from one state to the other. So it's via some lookup table. And if the lookup table is organized enough, you can actually present it as a set of algorithms, if else then algorithms.
So is that the kind of thing that you see happening with these cells, that there's an if else then?
Some kind of state machine is evolving and it's obeying certain rules. But in the process of obeying those rules, it's growing into something bigger and new. That is what fascinates me, because I don't think anyone's got a good answer for that. But yet it happens. So this is, okay, we're going to get to the place why I don't want this recorded. And don't laugh at me.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm just trying to take it in. In the process, some kind of state machine is evolving, and in the process, it turns into something new.
Right. So it's growing. There's some kind of computational process happening, because you can see the patterns moving around step by step. Each time there's a cell division, which is a ka-chunk, that's a clock of the system. You get a new embryo, which is double what it was before. And now it's in a different configuration. And different parts of it are evolving separately. And so in this case, there's kind of a tree instead of, of possibilities going out, and the embryo is falling one of those trees out as it grows. And it's doing so by some rules that you're seeing expressed in terms of electrical activities.
And then now you're going to get to the part where the reason we don't publish this. So
right. And the reason it sparks me is I've always been playing with this science fiction story. And one of the final episodes is when the first artificial life form is created. And exactly the question is, how would you do that? Now, I've started with this asynchronous arrays. I think I sent you a little email on that. It's a fascinating area in computation where you create these asynchronous arrays. Actually, each little cell on the IC chip is its own little state machine by itself. And it's coupled to its neighbors. And each transition of that little state machine, that little electronic element, it depends on its neighbors. But of course, then the next step, its neighbors depend on it. So you can create, if you take thousands, millions of these little chips, wire them together, and then you turn loose cellular automata that live on the electronics array. So now, since these chips are very primitive, you can have a self-assembly. In fact, that's the indefinitely scalable part of that acronym, means that you can, while the system is running, the computer system is running, it can be adding to it, it can be taking parts out, it can be repairing cells that have died. So as this computer is growing now by a process of self-assembly, excuse me. How does the computer know what to do next? As new elements are added to it, there has to be some feedback, some loop, some control signal going from the bulk of the processor to these new elements that are becoming part of the system to tell them what to do or how to organize or I don't know. So, and the computer has options. It's controlling its own self-assembly, its own growth. And when I saw the embryo, I thought that's a good example to work from because that's exactly what I'm trying to create in hardware.
So hold on a minute. Now, when you were talking just now about the self-assembly and somewhere it's getting the information to, you know,
How does it know what to do
about
next?
a real thing that actually exists? Or is this just a theoretical construct that people are talking about?
It's purely theoretical, but it is doable with current technology. It's just
And it's doable without any outside algorithm informing it on as to what the next step is?
Well, if it's going to work, there has to be something like that. But all of the mechanics, the electronics exist today to do something like that. So that's sort of my personal challenge as a design engineer, is to find what that extra, secret sauce is that's going to make the computer self-assemble itself.
Did you happen to read the last chapter of Mark Solmes's book?
No, I don't have his book, so.
I'm gonna try to copy off some pages from the last chapter because it's kind of terrifying. Because his idea is that if there's going to be an artificial life form, people like him need to get out ahead of the curve and decide what it's going to look like. And so his chapter is all about what this artificial life form would look like, this artificial intelligence. And I got to send that to you.
Okay.
Because I have a feeling there's some kind of overlap here.
I think there probably will be a lot.
I felt very uncomfortable with what he was saying. So
yeah, if I had, if there's any subtext to a lot of my thinking, is that I wish the church would listen, because the church needs to know this stuff is coming down the pipe, and you can't just make it go away by not paying attention.
have you heard any of the conversations that John Lennox has had about this? He's done a number of conversations about artificial intelligence, and his newest book, I believe, is 2084. And the whole thing is about artificial intelligence. And in most of his talks, he talks about how it's coming and we need to listen. And in some ways it's not to be feared, and in other ways it is to be feared. And so he talks about the difference between artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence.
Right.
He says artificial intelligence is already here, but
it's been here for
a long way to go before we get to artificial general intelligence.
Well, I would say that AGI is already here. And that was...
In what sense?
In the sense that the social media, the narrative, is a life form. It's taken on a life of its own. So
it's like kind of like mob rule, where mob rule, when it's in person, it becomes like an organism with a life of its own, and people get caught up in it and they can't see what they're doing, and it takes over their processing center. And so everybody starts working together towards a goal that would not necessarily be any individual's goal. And social media is doing the same thing out in cyberspace.
Exactly, because companies like Google and Facebook, their business model is harvesting your data to sell to advertisers. So they're invested in keeping you tied to the internet, especially clicks. Clicks are very important. And so the more they can keep you angry or upset, or the more you'll click. Sometimes I think some of the trolls that end up on different comment sections are actually paid to be there just for the fact they generate clicks.
Mm-hmm.
So Google and Facebook has a vested interest in keeping society on an emotional edge, because that keeps the business model going. And so you get this dynamic now, whereas anything that would end the hysteria, take the emotional element out of the current narrative running things, will be censored by the media, the social media giants, because it will cut into their business model. It's a perfect storm of a lot of different factors all coming together to make this dynamic that becomes stable. It doesn't have to be necessarily thoughtful, it's just a stable dynamic that gets set up. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that a lot. I hadn't put it all together as coherently as you have, but I've certainly thought about it.
And then, well, then you make the next step and just say, well, since it's acting intelligently as a single entity, then you can call it an evil spirit. Why not? It's possessing people. So anyway, that's how I go from being a physicist to talking about possession. All in the
Well, I
same
mean,
sense.
that's exactly the kind of thing that Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson talk about when they're talking about what a spirit is. And it totally makes sense.
Mhm.
And
So,
there's really only one answer, and that answer would be like a worldwide revival. Because, I mean, when we have our eyes on him, then our life is organized around the right pattern. And when we take our eyes off him onto something else, then our life gets organized around the wrong pattern. And any
right.
one of those wrong patterns is enslaving us. Whether that wrong pattern is social media or food or alcohol or
Yeah, there's all sorts of stable dynamics that can get us off track. It's addictions, we call them idols. Idol worship is just a false narrative that you can get sucked into. That's one abstract mathematical way to look at things.
No, that's a really good picture. It's a false narrative.
So,
Because all the false narratives look to me like the ideologies look to me like addictions. And so that ties it up nicely. If addictions and idol worship and false narratives are all one thing, well, the addiction is a symptom, no, is a consequence of adhering to the false narrative. And that's why Jordan Peterson is under such attack, because he is one of the people who is so effective in turning people away from that stable dynamic.
Yeah, he's Van Helsing with the crucifix. And the vampire sensing his presence and trying to swat him away.
Is Van Helsing?
Remember the Dracula story?
Yeah.
Van Helsing was the professor who understood vampires, who was trying to warn people.
Oh, he had the silver cross.
Yeah, they would talk about, the mirrors and stuff. He tried to show a mirror to the Dracula, the old black and white one. And Bela Lugosi, was that who played?
I don't know. I was never into the Dracula thing, so I never saw any of those movies. But I know the general drift of it.
But yeah, there was one line that I always remember, and Van Helsing is saying, the power of the vampire is that something like the people don't want to believe he exists. It wasn't that people don't believe he exists, it's people don't want to think that something like that can happen. So that gives him, that was his power.
Well, that, I mean, that's certainly the power of Satan, but
Yeah,
it's also seems to be what happens to people with the Lord. They don't want to believe that he exists because it's too darn scary.
Mhm.
That's what Jordan is always saying. Well, back to the cellular thing. Do you have an idea of where you want to take that, or did
Well,
you just find it mildly interesting and you wanted to talk about it, or does it actually fit into something that you're working towards?
I'd say it's something I'm working towards. The science fiction story centers on creating the first interstellar spaceship, I guess. There's no such thing as warp drive. The first trip to the nearest star will be conventional, and so it will take thousands of years to get there.
Mhm.
So how do you build let's say a computer that's going to run for 4,000 years? You know, there's no technology we have electronic wise that's going to last for more than 30 or 40 years. The whole quantum computer thing is so intensive on support machinery, it wouldn't last a month before it all collapsed. So if you're going to build a system that's going to run and work for 4,000 years, it has to be something that can repair itself, can sustain damage, can rebuild, change, reconfigure itself, so that it's constantly growing. And if you look at something like an ant colony, the ants only live for a few weeks to maybe a year, I think, depending on species. But the ant colony can go on for 50 years. And even if a queen dies, they still have ways to reproduce a new queen. So if you're going to make a computational system that's going to last for thousands of years, it's going to have to be something on the a collective intelligence, like an ant colony. So how do you build something like that, starting from electronics, from the technologies we have? So the ants in this case are the cellular automata, and the underlying electronics, the asynchronous arrays, is the termite mound, or whatever, it's the world they live in. And now you have a system that can be damaged. I don't know if you remember that clip from Dave Ackley on the demon horde sort. So you can have algorithms that will do computations. If the underlying hardware is damaged, it can repair itself. The cellular automata reproduce, they can evolve. So everything's there to create the underlying hardware to make a system that can run for, as long as it has raw materials to make new silicone chips, it can keep going indefinitely. And even if it was damaged or change its shape, reconfigure. But that's one of the last questions I have. See, before I write the story, I want to make sure that it works in hardware, so that when I write the story, I know no one's going to argue with it. And that's the last step that I've run into. I can create the underlying hardware, the cellular automata array. You can create ASIC parts that are small enough and lend themselves to a self-assembly process. Dave Ackley's done a lot of the work already with the cellular automata as computational systems. So the last piece of the puzzle is, as I grow the cellular, the asynchronous array, how do the cellular automata living on it know what to do with it? And it can't be just the coding in the cellular automata themselves. It can't just be digital code. Something else has to be going on in the system for it to grow. And so it has to.
So you need it to grow, not just to continually regenerate. You need it to get bigger and more powerful over time.
Right, it keeps growing, because that's how you build such a system. You make a baby and then you raise it, and it builds itself, and you have to raise it like a child as it's maturing. So the Singularity Institute, transhumanists, that crowd, they postulate that you can create some kind of supercomputer and then transfer the human consciousness into the computer directly. And I'm in the school that says, no, you can't do that. That if intelligence is going to be created artificially, it's going to have to be raised just like a child and grow and be socialized and along in the process.
And so you can't just do that through inputting data that starts simple and becomes more complex over time. Like with a child, children grow because you're constantly inputting data.
Right, but they want to have to grow. You know, that's the thing. Babies already have this learning dynamic thing going on, which is not, it's not DNA. It's like,
It's desire.
desire.
Yeah.
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 Which gets you into the home, Holmes thing, where there's this emotional level to consciousness, which is being controlled chemically, the endocrine system. There's something going on besides the neural network at a deeper level, which is making us
And it
want
goes
to do
way
things.
beyond, it goes way beyond those simple value paradigms that he was talking about, because I don't know if you ever heard the conversation I had with Michael, but I was talking about when any baby, but I mean, I'm just remembering Megan, when she was little, when it was time to learn a new skill, she would practice it over and over and over and over again. Well, what was driving her to practice that until she got there?
Mhm.
Is because she wanted something that she couldn't get with her current level of skill. And so she had to develop the next level of skill in order to get the thing that she wanted.
Mhm.
And her frustration level would grow during that time. So she'd go through a period of time just before crawling, just before walking, just before talking. She'd act out and become, naughty because she was trying so hard to get to something.
Mhm.
And she would spend hours and sacrifice. Stand up, fall down, stand up, fall down, skin your knee, stand up, fall down, until you could get to the place you could take that first step. That was all because of a desire of something that she wanted that was outside her reach. So you'd have to, if you're going to get it to want to grow, it has to have some aspiration that's outside its reach,
Mhm.
right?
So yeah, so my design challenge as a hardware guy is to somehow incorporate that into the electronics I'm building. And that's, I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone else has an answer. I don't think anyone's even bothered to ask the question.
Well, so what would happen if you had a bunch of babies together, the way that when you have all these cells together in the tadpole, they're communicating with each other. It's a project.
Mhm.
We have to get from here to there. Right now we're a tadpole. That frog is where we have to get, and we have to build certain systems to get there.
Mhm.
How are we going to do it? They're working together. It's not a single organism making a decision to move there. It's a bunch of different messaging systems communicating with each other to come up with a plan, a body plan of who's going to be what part and how tall is this one going to grow and how long is that one going to grow, right?
Bingo. The embryo is not one thing, it's a committee
Yeah.
of people trying, or things or something, trying to decide what to do next.
But if you had a bunch of babies in a room, so I wonder how this would work. If you had a bunch of babies in a room and there's something that they all want, would they figure out a way to grow faster to get the skill to get there? Or would they come up with a workaround to get what they want, to get one of the babies closer to the thing so that baby could share with everybody else? I mean, maybe the communal thing actually hinders the growth. I don't know.
Well,
But certainly what's happening in those tadpoles is it's a community. It's a committee.
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, my goal is to figure out or duplicate what the embryo is doing, but in electronics hardware. And that is kind of an existential question almost. Is that doable? How would I do it? It's certainly not in the digital side. You know, that's the easy part, the if and or else gates, you know, the signals going back and forth between chips. But something else has to be happening. I have to incorporate some other level of control. And then that's when I look at the human brain isn't just a neural network. There's a whole chemical state machine underneath the neural network, which, depending on our emotional state, controls how the electrical state works. So you can have more than one computational system instantiated in the same piece of hardware. Does that make sense? There's an underlying state machine, which is your emotional dynamic. And then there's a more neural network, electronic level on top of that. And one controls the other. Your thoughts control your emotions control your thoughts. So there's two a Turing engine up here and a state machine down here, and they're controlling each other's function. So that's when I look at the human brain, I go, wow. And so like Mark Holmes is.
Well, and then there's supposed to be a third level, which is the spirit, because if you're controlled by the spirit, then all those other things will order themselves naturally.
Yeah.
If you're controlled by the emotions, you're in complete disorder all the time.
Right. So there's another layer above us that I think that's where our humanity comes from. That just by ourselves, we're not really humans. So yeah, but how do you sense that next layer up? And I like that notion of quality from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. That when I see that, I'm saying, yeah, that's how we're sensing the next layer up. We look at a machine, we look at something, and we feel like there's quality. We know that things, when you get it right, there's an emotional signal that comes with that. And that to me is the layer up talking to the layer down. And that's how we communicate. It's through the emotional. So I often wonder, as an artist, do you get that feeling as you work on something that there's something that's not right, you need to fix it, you need to, and then all of a sudden it starts to come in and you go, okay, now I've got it.
I never get there. I can get closer. And sometimes if I sell a painting right when it's done, then it's off my plate and I don't worry about it anymore so much. But anything that I keep that hasn't sold yet, I'm always looking at it, trying to figure out, how do I get it there? How do I have one really big painting right now that I've had hanging in my living room for 3 years. I've repainted it 3 or 4 times, but because it's such a big painting, every little change well, you can't just make one change. When you make a change, you have to change the whole thing in order to get the cohesion. And it's a lot of work, but I'm still looking at it because it's not there. I mean, it's a perfectly serviceable painting, but it's not my vision, right?
Yeah. But the question is, what are you reacting to? I mean, your emotions are real. You're picking up on something that's real out there.
Yeah. And it's definitely not me. Yeah. I mean, it's something out there.
So I think people think that only happens at human level, consciousness level. And I think what I'm trying to say is that dynamic is happening even at the most grunt level of mechanical and electronics design. It's that pattern is still emerging. Somehow the computer array is sensing there's an order, there's a dynamic out there, and it's trying to find it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. With the tadpole trying to become a frog, it has to know, I mean, it's that word telos, I guess. It has to know what its purpose is. It has to know what that looks like in order to get there. Once it starts growing, it has to know when to stop. And it has to know how to share responsibility, right?
Yeah, so we see that at our level of emergence as a sense of self. It's a layer of programming that spontaneously writes itself as we mature, as I always say, the memes that make us us come to terms with the genes that make us us. We figure out what our talents are, what our abilities are, how we fit in to the people around us, where's our pecking order in the social network. And so you develop over time, hopefully, a mature, positive sense of self as you hit adulthood. And that, in a sense, is the blueprint that tells you how you're interacting in society, where your place is, how you communicate, what's expected of you. Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah.
the cells that form the embryo are doing a very basic, simple version of that, where they're jostling position. Okay, now you're an eye, no, and I'm an ear, or okay, and then you become good at what it is that you think you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
So
Every
it's the
part
same
has
pattern.
Yep. Every part has a purpose and a place in the pattern.
Mm-hmm. And it's the sense of self is the set of rules that govern how we fit into the bigger collective. And those are the rules that make the strong emergence happen.
So do you think that sorry, I'm trying to write this down. My notes are crazy. Do you think that is the same thing as when Jordan Peterson talks about how meaning, our sense of meaning is our guide? That when things line up, when we see something line up, like when a symphony, all the parts come together and it's just that moment when everything lines up and you're, or if you see a painting or a beautiful flower, or you have a sense of purpose in your work, you're in the zone or whatever, that sense of meaning, is that when the pattern, is that when your sense of self lines up with the pattern?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah, it's when that's what I would say we call the transcendent experience.
Mm-hmm.
You all of a sudden pick up on the bigger pattern that's sitting out there and you go, oh, wow, so that's what it is. And it's like your eyes open, you see things you didn't see before, all the words and expressions that come with that transcendent experience. But yeah, so I would say, Jordan Peterson is onto that. The caveat for me is I would say your sense of self could be tied to the transcendent, or it can be tied to the opinions of people around you.
Yeah.
And so Jordan Peterson is talking about a sense of self that's tied to the transcendent aspects of our world, our life experience. Whereas social media is our sense of self is tied to the opinions of others. One is not a healthy dynamic and the other one is.
Yep. Hey, this has been great, Glenn. I gotta go, but
Okay.
But let's definitely plan on having at least a conversation about Ptolemy and Copernicus and those
Okay.
guys.
Well, give me a week to work on it or so.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
I don't want to derail you from what you're working on, because I know I can eat up a lot of your time, so I don't want to do that. But
Well, I know,
I
but
think
this is a good way to spend my time.
okay. Well, yeah, anytime you want to just have a chat and talk through some things, that's great too.
I just appreciate the feedback, whether I'm making sense at all.
I think you're making a lot of sense, and I don't think there's anything the least bit controversial in what you said, but you know it from inside your own head better than I can understand it. So maybe inside your own head, you're saying something bigger or beyond than what I'm understanding at this point. But I don't think there's anything the least bit controversial, and I think our conversation would be very enjoyable and instructive for people, but I will not publish it. I will abide by your.
Well, if you think it's good enough, I will trust your judgment because it has been fun. And
Yeah.
if your listeners don't mind a kind of rambling coffee house midnight level of a conversation, then I'm happy.
Well, maybe that's what it's always going to be from now on, because I don't always have time to do this in-depth research before I talk to somebody, and I can't be some sparkling genius.
Okay. Well, you have my permission.
Okay, well, very good. It's been great, and give my best to Paula, and
I will.
really good talking to you, and let's talk Ptolemy and Copernicus next time.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.